I have finished another on my poison book list. This one is The Poison King by Adrienne Mayer. It is about Mithridates, who probably isn't as well known today as he was sort of in the Middle Ages. He was a king in sort of the Anatolia area, which is Turkey now, and he was contemporary to Pompey and Julius Caesar. He actually comes just a little bit before them. Pompey was the one who claimed to have actually defeated Mithridates in the end. Um, Mithridates is interesting because he's probably best remembered for the fact that he was so interested in poisons and spent a lot of time collecting poisons from different countries, and was rumored to have used poisons on himself in small amounts enough that he became immune to certain ones, such as arsenic and things like that. You can kind of build up a certain immunity to some amounts. He really had a pretty good run in challenging Rome when it came down to it. Probably, I would say he was more successful than Hannibal in challenging Rome, but he's not as well remembered as Hannibal is. Mithridates, one of the bigger things is he set off a whole, basically a purge of Roman people living in his kingdom area, which was pretty large. It contained a pretty large amount of where Turkey and around it was down towards Greece. At that time, he had a purge of Romans, and basically they massacred. They are not sure how many, just thousands and thousands of Romans that were living in those areas. And he coordinated that particular, and it was a genocide. He coordinated that. I've never read a story of someone whose whole life was so many ups and downs. It was a huge amount of, he'd have a success against Rome, then something would happen, and he'd have a success, then someone would betray him. He himself was very paranoid about a lot of different things. I believe because his father was more than likely killed by his mother. Very similar situation. There's a lot of parallels. He felt a lot of parallels between himself and Alexander the Great, and tried to, if you look at the portraiture of him, he even tries to make himself look like Alexander the Great and bring up that image a lot with the clean shaven and a lot of the long curly hair. He tried to reinforce that. This is one of this. You could not ask for a more thorough book on this, and it is very readable. The only issue I have with Mayer is the fact that she does this thing that historical writers do sometimes that I do not like, and it is this sort of speculative history. It happens a lot when they don't have a lot of information to actually prove their point. So they will say stuff like, well, we can only imagine, or it can only be assumed that when that's not necessarily true. Unless you can give me, and unless you can frame that type of thinking in a certain way, if you can frame that in, well, we think this might be true because XYZ, when they do it in this dramatic, like, let us imagine type of way, I don't consider that really good. I don't consider that really good proof of anything, because it is just basically sitting and speculating that, and that to me is no better than word of mouth on certain things, or one historical legend. It's kind of hard to prove. On the other hand, she does prove her point about certain other things, that she thinks there's a tie between the last lover that Mithridates had, and somebody who was a historian that had a very similar name. The woman that he was tied to he used a masculine name with her because she was a warrior. She was somebody who fought and was from a tribe that did that a lot. And it turns out that there is a historian with the male version of her name, which she also used, that does a lot of there's historical, that was one of the historical accounts. So that does seem very coincidental, and it does seem like that might have possibly be an accurate thing. But when it comes down to some of the other things about, well, we can only imagine, or we can only this and that, or speculate, if you will. It's that type of, I don't like that type of, you need to prove it to me. And there's also some stuff with when it comes to his mother, I don't feel like was quite proved. Or his sister, actually, his first wife. He married a sister. We keep getting into a lot of that. Apparently that and poison go hand in hand. But this is just, I understand the motivation that for his sister wife to betray him without having to need some sort of special motive, like just be an evil person. I also see her as being kind of desperate in that situation too, that's not really taken into account. It's more just like, and then she evilly betrayed him. And I'm like, well, based off of his personality and who he was and how he did things, I don't necessarily, that might have been a desperation play. You can't quite rule that out. That might have been, I'm going to get him before he gets me type of a thing. So that's what I said with this sort of, it's just sort of the type of writing historically, I'm not really fond of. And that's not to say she didn't do her homework. This thing is like 350 pages long with just copious notes. So I'm not saying that she's wrong about her information. It's just a conceit of historian writing that I don't necessarily like. A lot of time is that sort of, well, we can only assume. Well, we can't assume. That's part of history. With that, you can't assume. You have to prove. And Mithridates, like I said, up and down. She makes a lot of effort to point out how barbaric the Romans were in this case, but then also Mithridates is, I consider this both sides are dicks. I mean, in this case, both sides are awful, and there's nobody coming out looking good in any of this. And I can understand we can romanticize Mithridates a little bit, just because of the poison and the weird stuff and the fact that he's standing up to Rome and everything. But he's just as terrible. He is just as terrible. He poisons a good number of family members based off them betraying him. He poisons a good number of there's a lot happening in all of this. This is yet the second book that is just an absolute train wreck of family situations. Only in this case, Mithridates lived till he was in his 70s. So one of the big stories with him was always the fact that he was so afraid of poison, that he had poisoned himself so many times. When they finally came down to him wanting to off himself before the Romans got there to drag him back for a triumph, he tried to poison himself and it didn't work. And eventually he had to have his bodyguard kill him. But that was always the big story with him. And she does frame that in a certain way that makes a little more sense, because it does seem that he should, as somebody who knew poisons as well as he did, should know what it would take to kill him based off of the fact that he'd had immunity build up to poisons. But he also had 2 daughters there in the tower with him at the same time, and more than likely he used some of his poison to hasten their deaths, and therefore he did not have the right amount, and it did not kill him like he thought it would, which makes sense. All of that does make sense, that particular sort of assumption. That seems to fit. But that was always the story with him. And like I said, the Middle Ages, they kind of romanticized him a little bit in a certain way that we don't now. I don't remember ever him barely being brought up at all. He would be like mentioned in certain stuff in ancient history and different things like that. It was always Hannibal is the one that got talked about the most. Um, Perhaps the one that kind of fascinated me in all this was Sulla, who I did know about a great deal because he was Roman. It was Roman in the Senate era before we got into Julius Caesar and the emperors and all of that. And I knew Sulla and Marius there was battling back and forth with these two guys, these two major generals. And Sulla really was awful, but there was some interesting stuff with him that like his name actually means like pimple, and part of his thing was the fact that he apparently had like really bad acne. Like the part that's just brought up in here, and the fact that like when they're describing him and the histories, and the fact that you can tell the dude just had really bad acne, and I just thought that was a strange thing. That was a strange side note in history that no one thinks about with this dude, but also horrible human. Let's just everyone in here is terrible. If we get right down to it, I think every single person I hate in here in some way, shape, or form, they're all horrible human beings. But also the kind of concept of what military was and running an army. I know when I was doing classical history in college, the idea of the decimation of a military force that had done something mutinous or something bad seemed very harsh. The fact that you just line all your guys up and you kill every 10th one as punishment, whether they did anything or not, that to me seemed very, very extreme. But based off of the Wild West that was trying to control a large number of fighting force at this time, kind of makes sense a little more. The whole fact that this kind of tyrannical running of your military had to be done that way, because there are so many times in here that somebody would have actually won had they been able to get their soldiers to cooperate. Or their soldiers, they tell them don't do that, and they're like, no, we're going to do whatever. And you end up with this sort of Wild West of military. It's basically like you get a mob of people and try to sort of aim them in the right direction and hope that they win, and in the process you don't get distracted by looting stuff. It really is. I sort of do start to understand why we kind of get sort of those draconian rules in Roman history, in what we consider Empire Rome, that type of history. I do start to understand that, because it seems like when you have a large number of soldiers, you can't control them real well, unless you do have an absolute total fear in order of things. So, like I said, this was worth reading. It did have a few things that I just didn't necessarily were not my way of liking how a history is written, but this is this is the most thorough you're ever going to find about Mithridates and this time period, including Rome, when you're talking about Sulla and early stages of Pompey and all this sort of thing that was going on at that time, particularly kind of in the East. Away from Rome. There's so much focus on Rome. We have such a Rome focus when we talk about history. This is an interesting look from not their perspective, and with a perspective them being the enemy and them being the kind of upstart wolf of a civilization that has kind of taken hold here and is pushing their way, and very rapacious in how they sort of take everything over and what they demand of the colonies they take over and different things. So I have finished The Poison King on my poison book list. So recommended. It's a lot of reading, but it's very readable. In this one, my last three on my poison list are kind of thicker books for whatever reason. Because the one I'm reading now is like 350 pages about arsenic. So, anyway, worth a read on the Poison King, who couldn't poison himself in the end.